One of the first considerations when creating a hypertrophy training program is which training split you should follow. There are many different training split options, so how do we know which is best specifically for us? Throughout this video, we will try to answer this question. First, we need to understand what exactly the term training split actually means. The training split refers to which muscles are trained on which days of the week. Furthermore, it may also determine which muscles are emphasized more than others on specific days. For example, let's look at a classic upper-lower split. This split involves the trainee lifting 4 times per week, training the upper body muscles on days 1 and 3, and the lower body on days 2 and 4. Another example would be the push-pull leg split, which trains the pressing muscles on days 1 and 4, so the chest, front delts, and triceps. The pulling muscles are trained on days 2 and 5, which would be the back, rear delts, and biceps, and the lower body is trained on days 3 and 6, so the quads, hamstrings, glutes, and calves. Essentially, the training split that we implement should be a product of 3 key variables. These are volume, frequency, and quality. Let's now cover how each of these variables influence hypertrophy, and how it may affect which training split we implement. The first and probably most important variable in this discussion is training volume. For hypertrophy training, volume refers to the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. Volume is quantified in this way because we can achieve equal hypertrophy outcomes using a large spectrum of different rep ranges and loads. So as long as we are training in the approximate 6 to 20 rep range and taking each set close to failure, then each set will be similarly hypertrophic. So what influence does volume have on muscle growth? Well, from what we currently understand, volume appears to have a dose-response relationship with muscle growth when all other factors are equated. So performing more volume tends to result in greater muscle growth. For example, this study explored the effects of training each muscle with 16 versus 24 versus 32 sets per week. It was found that more volume resulted in greater muscle growth for all muscles measured. So basically, we can achieve muscle growth even with low to moderate volumes, but more volume will likely result in a faster rate of muscle growth over any given period of time. The amount of volume we perform will have an influence on which training split we implement. If we perform a higher training volume for a certain muscle group, then we may need to train that muscle with a higher frequency to fit in all the volume. However, if we perform a lower volume for a certain muscle, then we may implement a split with a lower frequency for that particular muscle. This leads us to the next training variable to consider, which is frequency. Frequency refers to how many times per week a muscle is trained. It should be understood that when referring to frequency, we need to always assume volume is equated. So if we take the same volume, a higher frequency means that less volume is performed per session, while a lower frequency means that more volume is performed per session. For example, let's say we want to perform 12 total sets for a muscle across the week. If we train this muscle once per week, we would need to perform 12 sets in that one session. A frequency of 2 times per week means we need to perform 6 sets per session, and training the muscle 3 times per week means we require 4 sets per session. However, in either of these cases, the total weekly volume is still 12 sets. So how does frequency influence muscle growth? Well, it seems that frequency doesn't have a major influence on muscle growth when volume is equated, but it may have a small effect. This meta-analysis explored the research comparing different training frequencies. As we can see, there was a slight trend in favor of training with a higher frequency, although the magnitude of this was very small, and the difference didn't reach statistical significance. So it is generally recommended that trainees should try to hit each muscle group at least 2 times per week, rather than only hitting a muscle once per week. This evidence on frequency may influence our decision of what training split we implement. If possible, we would want to implement a training split which allows us to hit each muscle at least 2 times per week or more. This would probably be slightly superior compared with a training split where each muscle is only hit once per week. However, we should still keep in mind that total weekly volume is a more important consideration, whereas frequency is more so a method of distributing this volume. And the last factor to consider for our training split is training quality. This encompasses many different variables, but ultimately refers to the hypertrophic stimulus of each set. While more volume tends to result in greater hypertrophy outcomes, higher training quality will also have a positive effect. The training split we implement can have an impact on lifting quality and therefore the hypertrophic stimulus of each set. This relates back to the frequency research, which shows that higher frequencies seem to be slightly more hypertrophic compared with lower frequencies. This is likely because when we distribute our volume across multiple sessions, we perform less volume per session and can train in a less fatigued state. As a result, our training quality will be slightly greater and the hypertrophic stimulus will be superior. For example, this idea can be seen in this study, which compared training with 1 versus 3 minutes of interset rest. As we can see, the group implementing longer rest periods experienced greater muscle growth compared with a short rest group for all muscles measured. This is probably because the long rest group was able to lift with a greater overall volume load. In other words, they were able to lift more weight or perform more repetitions per set on average. While this isn't exactly what we are talking about, this study demonstrates a point. When we lift in a less fatigued state, lifting performance is better, and the hypertrophic stimulus is likely to be superior. So relating back to training splits, this has a similar practical meaning to the frequency topic. We ideally want to implement a training split which allows us to hit each muscle at least twice, if not more times per week, rather than hitting each muscle only once. This will allow us to perform better in each training session training that muscle group and likely result in a superior hypertrophic stimulus. So now that we have covered the theoretical details regarding training splits, we also need to explore the practical side of things. Each trainee has practical limitations, which will influence their training routines, so we need to consider these too. The first and most important practical consideration is how many times per week the lifter can and wants to train. This will obviously influence our training split, since the split must be tailored towards how many days per week we can lift. I always think it is best to create our training program within our practical constraints, rather than trying to manipulate our practical lifestyle to fit a certain training routine. Therefore, lifters should select a split which fits the number of training sessions they are able to perform per week. Another practical consideration when selecting a training split is which muscles you want to emphasize and which muscles are not as important to develop. This is individual for each lifter, based on which muscles are currently more or less developed relative to the rest of your physique, and which muscles you specifically want to emphasize. So for the muscles we want to emphasize, we should perform more volume for them, and for the muscles that aren't as important to develop, we don't need to spend as much time and energy training them. This will influence the training split we implement because we may want to train certain muscles more or less frequently based on their priority in our training program. And the last practical consideration when determining which training split to implement is the enjoyment factor. Some people prefer to train with specific split routines, while others don't have a particular preference. For example, it may not be theoretically ideal to train with a traditional bro split, where each muscle is trained once per week on separate days, but if this is something that you have done for a long time and you enjoy it, then you may want to implement this split. Furthermore, if you train with someone else or with a group of people, you may prefer to stick with a mutually agreeable split that suits all people involved. You can always train alone with your own individualized training split, but if you enjoy training with others, then you may need to compromise. There is absolutely nothing wrong with this, as long as we understand the inherent trade-offs that we may be making. So based on all of this information, let's establish some practical recommendations. There are no inherently best or worst training splits. The exact training split we implement will be determined by how training variables influence hypertrophy and also our practical constraints. We know that higher volumes will be beneficial for muscle growth, and distributing this volume across at least 2 sessions per week for each muscle group will also have a slight benefit. Furthermore, the training split must also fit within our practical constraints, such as how many days per week we have to train and which muscles we want to emphasize over others. So taking this information, let's go through 2 example training splits to provide a practical demonstration. First, let's say this trainee can lift 4 times per week and doesn't have any muscle groups they want to emphasize over others. So here we have implemented an upper-lower training split 4 times per week. As we can see, we have also changed the order of which muscles are trained in each session to slightly prioritize different muscles each session. In this next example, we have a lifter who can train 5 times per week and wants to train the entire body with a particular emphasis on the shoulders and arms. So in this example, we have a 5-day training split following an upper-lower protocol, with the 5th day being a full shoulders and arms workout. So all muscles receive a relatively similar training stimulus, but the shoulders and arms get an extra emphasis by being trained with a higher frequency and with more total volume. So as we can see, the training split we implement should be based on what will be theoretically most hypertrophic, as well as what works practically for each lifter.